Most people who've had a near-death experience describe the same thing. The tunnel. The light at the end of it. A warm, overwhelming pull towards something that felt like peace, like home, like everything they ever wanted. And every version of the story ends the same way. They went toward it, or they were sent back before they could reach it. That's the version you've heard. That's the version that shows up in best-selling memoirs, on daytime television, in hushed conversations at hospice bedsides. But there's another category of account, rarer, quieter, almost never platformed. The ones where someone reached that tunnel and refused it. Not out of fear, not by accident, out of recognition. And what happened next, according to those accounts, and according to a body of ancient cosmological literature that was nearly erased from history, is the part nobody is talking about. Because what the Gnostic tradition said about the tunnel of light, about what waits inside it, and about what happens to a soul that sees through it, that understanding didn't survive 2,000 years by accident. It survived in fragments, hidden in caves, buried under centuries of institutional silence. This video is about what those fragments say, about why refusal matters, and about what the Archons, the cosmic administrators the Gnostics described in extraordinary detail, reportedly do when a soul doesn't comply. Stay with me. This one goes deep. I'm Daniel, and this is Gnostic Talk. Here's something worth sitting with before we go any further. The tunnel of light experience, as it's reported across thousands of near-death accounts, is almost universally described as beautiful, comforting, overwhelmingly positive. People don't come back traumatized by the light. They come back changed, softened, less afraid of death. And yet, the Gnostic tradition, working from a completely different angle, from cosmological reasoning rather than personal experience reports, arrived at a warning about exactly that kind of encounter. Not because the light isn't real, but because real doesn't mean what we've been trained to assume it means. The Nag Hammadi texts, discovered in Upper Egypt in 1945, 52 manuscripts sealed in a clay jar and buried, almost certainly to protect them from destruction, contain a map of the cosmos that most people never encounter. Not because it's complicated, because it was systematically removed from the conversation. Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, wrote his famous assault on Gnostic teaching around 180 CE, and what followed over the next several centuries was not a theological debate. It was an erasure campaign. Communities disbanded, libraries burned, lineages cut, but the texts in that jar at Nag Hammadi survived. And what they describe is a cosmos structured in layers. At the highest level, the true source, which the Gnostics called the monad or the one, there is pure, undifferentiated light, genuine, uncontainable. The Apocryphon of John describes it this way: a light that no eye can behold, that contains everything without being contained by anything. Below that, something went wrong. The Gnostic creation narrative, and I've covered the mechanics of this in detail in my video, Church God versus the Monad, Every Difference They Buried from You, describes an emanation from the true source that fractured. A being they called the Demiurge came into existence and, crucially, didn't know it was secondary. It looked around at the darkness it occupied and assumed it was the highest, assumed it was the origin, and it began building. What it built was the material world, and the administrative layer it installed to govern that world, to manage souls, to keep the system running, the Gnostic texts called the Archons. Now here's where this connects directly to the tunnel. The Archons, according to texts like the Pistis Sophia, have a specific function at the boundary between incarnate existence and what comes after. They are gatekeepers, and the light that souls perceive at that threshold, that welcoming, magnetic, beautiful light, the Gnostic framework raises a question that almost no mainstream near-death researcher wants to ask. What if that light is theirs? Not the monad's light, not the light of the true source, but a constructed light, a simulated warmth, a system-generated experience designed to ensure compliance, to pull the soul back into the cycle, back into another incarnation, back under Archonic administration. I want to be careful here. I am not telling you the near-death experience is a lie. I'm telling you the Gnostics believed that not all light is equivalent, that the ability to generate a convincing imitation of divine warmth is well within the capacity of beings who are themselves derivatives of the real thing. That's not a fringe idea invented in modern conspiracy culture. That is the consistent cosmological position of multiple Nag Hammadi texts, and it has a specific logic once you understand what the demiurge is and how the Archonic system is supposed to function. One viewer wrote in after my video on the monad call, and this stopped me mid-scroll. They said, "I had a near-death experience 12 years ago. I went toward the light without thinking. I've always wondered why coming back felt like losing something, not gaining it." That comment sat with me for days, because that person wasn't describing a negative NDE. They were describing something more subtle, a sense that the encounter had resolved too easily, that something had been exchanged without their full understanding. The Gnostics would have recognized that feeling immediately. The Apocryphon of John is direct about this. The Archons don't take from you by force. They take by invitation, by your own unconscious movement toward what seems obvious, what seems comforting, what seems like the only option available. Before we continue, there's something I want to place in your hands. We've gathered the forgotten texts, the ones the Church sealed away for 17 centuries, into a single guide for those who feel the pull towards something deeper. Because whether we speak of the Archons, the Demiurge, or the Divine Spark, one truth remains. This knowledge was never meant to be lost. This is for anyone who senses there's more to this reality than we've been told, and who's ready to remember it. You'll find it in the link in the description below, or you can scan the QR code right here. I'll give you a moment to do that. The soul that moves toward the tunnel light without examination is, in Gnostic terms, a soul that has not yet remembered what it actually is. And a soul that hasn't remembered is a soul that can be redirected. So what does it mean to refuse the tunnel? Not physically, not through some act of will performed in a body that is, by definition, shutting down. The Gnostic answer to that question is more interesting and more demanding than simple willpower. The Pistis Sophia, one of the longer and more operationally specific Gnostic texts, likely composed somewhere between the 3rd and 4th centuries, describes what it calls the soul's ascent through the Archonic layers. Each layer has an administrator. Each administrator has a test. And the test is not moral in the conventional sense. It's not about whether you were kind, whether you confessed the right things, whether you observed the correct rituals. The test is recognition. Do you know what you are? Do you know where you came from, in the deepest sense of that question? Or have you been so thoroughly shaped by the system, so habituated to thinking of yourself as a body, a personality, a record of experiences, that you arrive at the threshold still holding those identities like luggage? Because if you do, the Archons don't need to force anything. You'll hand yourself back willingly. The light will feel like home, because everything in your entire incarnate experience was designed to make you associate warmth, belonging, and reunion with staying inside the system. Refusal, in the Gnostic sense, is not an act of aggression. It is an act of memory. The soul that refuses the tunnel is a soul that, in that moment, remembers something the incarnation was supposed to make it forget. That it is not a product of this world. That it carries, as the trimorphic protonoia describes it, a divine light spark, a pneuma, that is native to the pleroma, the true fullness, not to the Archonic construction below it. I spent an entire evening once, this was maybe 2 years into my serious engagement with the Nag Hammadi texts, just sitting with the ascent sequences in the Pistis Sophia, reading them slowly, rereading them. What struck me was how procedural they are. This is not poetry. This is not metaphor for its own sake. The text reads like someone describing a system they actually navigated, gate by gate, challenge by challenge. And at each gate, the soul that passes through is the soul that speaks from identity rather than from fear. Not, please let me through, but I know what I am, and your authority over me is contingent on my forgetting that. I haven't forgotten. That's the distinction that matters. Now here's where it gets cosmically significant, because the Gnostic ascent narrative isn't just about what happens after death. It maps onto something that can be practiced while alive. The same recognition that allows a soul to refuse the Archonic light at the boundary is the same recognition that Gnostic practice cultivated during incarnate life. The monad call, the contemplative traditions described in the Gospel of Philip, the interior turn described in the trimorphic protanoia, all of it points toward the same core move. Stop locating yourself in the personality the system gave you, and start locating yourself in the pneumatic spark the system can't touch. This is why the refusal of the tunnel, as a concept, isn't passive. It isn't nihilistic. It isn't a rejection of beauty or light as such. It is a very precise discrimination. Real light from constructed light. Genuine origin from administrative imitation. The monad from the demiurge. And the Gnostics were extraordinarily clear that this discrimination cannot be performed by the uninstructed soul. You cannot recognize a forgery you've never been told exists. You cannot choose an alternative exit when every story you've ever been given says the tunnel is the only one. That's not an accident. That's design. The Gospel of Philip puts it in language that, when I first read it, I had to set the text down and just breathe for a moment. It says, roughly, that the Archons want to deceive humans, not because humans are their enemies, but because humans contain something the Archons themselves do not have access to. The light spark, the pneuma, the fragment of genuine divine origin that makes an awakened human being, in cosmological terms, more than any Archon. That's the stakes. That's what the tunnel is designed to prevent you from fully understanding before you enter it. A soul that doesn't know it carries something irreplaceable will surrender it without negotiation. Here's the part most people don't get to, because most discussions of Gnostic cosmology stop at the map. They describe the Archons as a concept, explain the demiurge as a theological position, and then trail off into abstraction. But the Pistis Sophia and the Apocryphon of John don't stop at the map. They describe what happens when the system encounters a soul that doesn't comply. And it is not nothing. The Archons, according to these texts, have layers of response available to them. The first is rerouting. A soul that refuses the initial light encounter doesn't simply escape. The system has contingencies, other thresholds, other presentations of the same essential offer, restructured to be more compelling, more personalized, more precisely calibrated to whatever attachment the soul is still carrying. Think about that for a moment. The Pistis Sophia describes what amounts to an adaptive system. If warmth doesn't work, perhaps grief does, the apparition of a loved one beckoning. If that doesn't work, perhaps urgency, a sense that there is only one door, that time is running out, that hesitation itself is dangerous. The Archonic gatekeepers in this framework are not static, they are responsive. I personally think this is the most underrated dimension of the entire Gnostic cosmological system. The fact that the Archons are described not as dumb administrators, not as mechanical toll collectors, but as entities that understand human psychology with considerable precision. They know what you're attached to. They know what you fear. They know which presentation of the return pathway is most likely to work on a soul with your particular history. That is not the description of a passive system. That is the description of an intelligence. And this is where the Gnostic emphasis on preparation during incarnate life becomes existentially urgent. Because the soul that arrives at the Archonic threshold, well-rested in its own identity, that has been practicing recognition, has been doing the interior work of distinguishing the pneuma from the personality, That soul has something to draw on when the adaptive pressure increases. The soul that hasn't done that work, it's navigating the most complex and consequential encounter of its existence with no map and no practice. The Apocryphon of John describes a specific dynamic that I found genuinely unsettling the first time I read it carefully. It says that the Archons, when they encounter a soul that shows signs of pneumatic awareness, signs of actually remembering its true nature, escalate. Not violently, subtly. The presentation becomes more intimate, more convincing. The light becomes, if anything, more beautiful. The pull becomes stronger precisely because the soul is stronger. This is counterintuitive. We tend to assume that spiritual progress means progressively less interference, that the more awake you become, the more the obstacles retreat. The Gnostic texts suggest something different, that a soul which has genuinely begun to remember its origin is a soul the system has more reason to reclaim, not less. The pneumatic spark it carries has more coherence, more value in whatever sense that word translates to Archonic terms. And so the reclamation effort intensifies. I want to be precise about what I'm saying here, because it's easy to take this framework in a direction that becomes either paralyzing or conspiratorial in an unproductive way. The Gnostic texts are not describing a situation of hopelessness. They are describing a situation of necessary preparation. The Archons are formidable not because they are omnipotent, but because they operate in a domain where unprepared souls have essentially no reference points. Give a soul a reference point, and everything changes. The trimorphic protonoia frames the Divine Mother, the genuine divine presence that descends into the world, as doing exactly that. Coming down not to rescue souls by force, but to speak into them, to remind, to activate the latent recognition that the Archonic system depends on remaining dormant. She descends, the text says, 3 times. First as voice, then as speech, then as form. Each descent is a deeper inscription of the pneumatic memory into the soul that has ears to hear it. That's the countermove. Not escape through force, escape through recognition so thorough, so integrated, that the Archonic rerouting mechanisms simply have no purchase on a soul that has stopped identifying with what those mechanisms were designed to manipulate. The tunnel is only a trap for the soul that doesn't know there's something on the other side of it worth remembering. So let's talk about the mechanism itself, because understanding that recognition is the countermove isn't enough unless you understand what precisely the trap was engineered to do. The tunnel of light, and I want to be careful here because this term gets thrown around in near-death experience communities in ways that strip out all the conceptual weight behind it, is not, in the Gnostic framework, a metaphor for evil. It's a metaphor for efficiency. The Archonic system, as described in the Apocryphon of John, is not chaotic. It's architectural. It was built with intention, and its primary function is not punishment. It's repetition. Think about that for a moment. Not punishment, repetition. The demiurge, the craftsman god who built the material world in the image of a higher reality he could perceive but not truly understand, created a system that perpetuates itself. The Archons are the administrators of that system. And what does any self-perpetuating system require above everything else? It requires that the components inside it do not recognize they are components. It requires that the soul inside the cycle experience the cycle as reality rather than as mechanism. The tunnel in this framework is the re-entry protocol. It's the reset. I spent a long stretch of time, this was maybe 2 years ago now, I was deep in a reading phase where I was barely sleeping properly because I'd find one thread in a text and pull it until 3 a.m. I spent a long stretch working through the sections of Pistis Sophia that deal with what happens to souls between incarnations. And what stopped me cold wasn't the description of punishment or suffering. Those sections exist, but they weren't what got me. What got me was the bureaucratic precision of the reincarnation sequence. There are Archons described as having specific jurisdictional roles. There are souls being passed between them. There are what the text describes as the seals of forgetfulness. Not punishment, administration. The soul is processed. Its memory of its pneumatic origin is not erased through violence. It's filed away under layers of material identification until the pneumatic nature is still there, technically, but functionally unreachable. That's the trap. Not fire, paper. And the tunnel in this reading is the final seal. The light at the end of the near-death tunnel is, in Gnostic cosmological terms, deeply ambiguous. Because the question is not whether light is present. The question is, whose light? Light that emanates from the pleroma, from the fullness of divine reality beyond the demiurge's constructed cosmos, carries a specific quality. It's described in the Apocryphon of John as light that no eye can behold, which is not a statement about brightness. It's a statement about ontological category. It's not photons. It's not any physical or quasi-physical phenomenon. It's recognition itself, made luminous. The light in the tunnel is not that. The light in the tunnel, in this framework, is the Archonic system's most elegant feature. It's familiar. It feels like home. It feels like arrival. And that feeling, that overwhelming sense of peace, recognition, warmth, is exactly what a mechanism designed to recapture pneumatic souls would feel like if it had been refined over countless cycles. You don't retrap something with terror. Terror triggers resistance. You retrap something with warmth, with welcome, with the sensation of having finally arrived somewhere safe. Now here's where it gets cosmically significant. The soul that refuses the tunnel isn't refusing light. It's refusing the imitation of light. And the Gnostic texts are very specific that this refusal is not an act of will in the conventional sense. It's not white-knuckling your way past a glowing doorway. It's something that happens when recognition is already so deep, so integrated into the soul's self-understanding that the imitation simply doesn't register as real. The soul that knows the pleroma, not intellectually, not as a concept filed somewhere in its reading history, but as a lived gnosis, as something it has touched. That soul does not mistake the copy for the original. It's not a heroic act. It's more like how you cannot be convinced that a photograph of a person is the person themselves once you've met the person. The gap is too obvious. The resolution is too low. And this is why the Gnostics were so insistent that gnosis was not the same as knowledge. Knowledge can be stored. Gnosis has to be inhabited. You can know that the tunnel is a re-entry protocol and still walk into it, because knowing and inhabiting are different operations. The Archons, to put it plainly, are not threatened by people who have read about this. They are threatened by people who have remembered it from the inside. I'm Daniel, and this is Gnostic Talk, and I want to be precise about something before we go further, because this next section is the one that either lands or gets dismissed, depending on how ready you are to sit with it. Refusing the tunnel is not a deathbed decision. That's the version that gets circulated in certain near-death experience communities, and I understand why it has traction. The tunnel appears at death, so logically, the refusal happens at death, right? But in the Gnostic tradition, that framing is almost entirely backwards. Because the soul that encounters the tunnel at death, with no prior preparation, no prior gnosis, no established thread of pneumatic recognition to follow, that soul doesn't really have the option of refusal in any meaningful sense. Before we continue, some of what I've learned simply never makes it onto YouTube. That's why I started the Gnostic Newsletter, a free newsletter where I go deeper into esoteric Gnostic teachings, hidden wisdom, and the mysteries we don't share in these videos. And when you sign up, you'll receive a Gnostic guide to mastering reality as a welcome gift, completely free. You'll find it through the link in the description below or by scanning the QR code on your screen. I'll give you a moment to do that. The preparation isn't something you do at the threshold. The preparation is everything you do before you reach it. This is the piece I personally think is the most underrated dimension of the entire Gnostic project. Not the cosmology, Not the dramatic mythology of Sophia's fall or the demiurge's craftsman arrogance, though those are staggering frameworks in their own right, but this. The idea that the Liberation Project is fundamentally a pre-mortem undertaking. You don't escape the cycle at the moment of death. You escape it in life, through a quality of recognition so thorough that by the time the threshold arrives, what you carry with you is already oriented towards something the tunnel cannot imitate. So what does that look like? What are the actual mechanics? The Gnostic texts approach this from multiple angles, and the angles don't always agree in their specifics. These were distinct communities with distinct practices, and I want to resist the temptation to flatten them into a single unified system. But certain threads appear across the Nag Hammadi texts with enough consistency that they're worth naming. First, the cultivation of pneumatic self-identification. This sounds abstract, so stay with me. The texts are consistently insistent that the human being is not merely the material body, not merely the psychic or animating soul, but something they describe as the pneuma, the spirit, the fragment of genuine divine light that the demiurge inadvertently breathed into the human form while trying to replicate the higher image he'd perceived. The Apocryphon of John tells this story with striking directness. The demiurge and his archons tried to create a human being in the image of the luminous template they'd seen reflected in the waters below the pleroma. But the form they made was inert, unable to rise, until the higher divine reality, the true mother, or Barbello, or Sophia, depending on which text you're reading, breathed actual pneumatic light into the figure. The Archons, the text says, were alarmed by this. The thing they made now contained something they hadn't authorized. That something is what the Gnostic project is oriented toward, helping the human being identify with the unauthorized element, not the constructed one. Not the body the Archons shaped, not the personality the world conditioned. The pneuma that arrived, in a sense, uninvited and untouched. Second, the practice of interior recognition through what the texts call gnosis. And as I mentioned, this is not intellectual accumulation. The Gospel of Philip, which I keep returning to because it's one of the densest and most practically oriented of the Nag Hammadi texts, describes the difference between those who know the truth and those who have found it. Knowing the truth from the outside, being told it, reading it, accepting it as a proposition, leaves you, in Philip's framing, essentially unchanged. Finding it from the inside, through a direct interior movement of recognition, changes the category of the soul entirely. Philip calls this the difference between a slave who is set free and a son who has never not been free. The slave who is set free knows he was a slave. The son simply lives from his nature. Third, and this is where the preparation becomes most concrete, the texts describe specific practices of what we might call pneumatic attention. Staying oriented toward the interior light rather than the exterior spectacle. In the dialogue of the Savior from the Nag Hammadi corpus, there's a passage that keeps stopping me every time I reread it. The lamp of the body is the mind. As long as what is inside you is kept in order, your bodies are luminous. That phrase, kept in order, is doing a lot of work. It's not passivity. It's a continuous, active practice of returning attention to the pneumatic core rather than allowing the archonic theater of the material world, the emergencies, the identifications, the panics, the pleasures, to claim the center. A viewer who goes by the name Seraphel left a comment on my video, Church God versus the Monad, Every Difference They Buried from You, that I've thought about more than once since. She wrote, "Every time I try to meditate on the monad, I get pulled back into thinking about my job, my relationships, my body, and then I feel like I've failed. Is that the Archons?" And I thought, yes, that is exactly the Archonic mechanism, doing what it was designed to do. Not dramatically, not with fire, with your inbox and your back pain and what someone said to you at lunch. The mundane is not incidental to the trap. The mundane is the mechanism. Now let's zoom out, Because the question that every serious student of Gnostic thought eventually has to sit with is not just, is this cosmology compelling? The question is, why does almost no one know this? Why did these frameworks, which were alive and circulating and apparently persuasive enough to generate entire communities of practice across the Mediterranean world, essentially vanish? Why do most people encounter the word Gnostic only as a footnote in a church history class, dismissed in 2 sentences as ancient weirdness? The answer is not mysterious. It's documented. And the documentation is, I'll be honest, one of the reasons I find the suppression argument not just plausible, but almost impossible to discard. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing his massive refutation of what he called knowledge falsely so called around 180 CE, was not responding to a marginal fringe. You don't write 5 books against something that poses no threat. You don't organize councils, write formal denunciations, and successfully lobby imperial authorities to enforce your position against something that's lost in the margins of history. Irenaeus was responding to something that had real reach, real intellectual credibility, and real institutional competition with what was becoming proto-Orthodox Christianity. The communities he was targeting, the Valentinians in particular, the Sethians, the followers of Basilides, were not hiding in caves. Valentinus himself, as I've mentioned in previous videos, came within a single vote of becoming Bishop of Rome. 1 vote. Think about what that means for a moment. The man whose entire theological system rested on the idea that the creator God of the Hebrew Bible was not the highest God, that the material world was a kind of tragic mistake, that liberation required direct experiential knowledge of the true divine source, that man very nearly held the most powerful institutional position in early Christianity. If that vote had gone the other way, the history of Western religion looks completely different. Not marginally different, structurally different. The entire architecture of sin and salvation, of petition and pleading, of institutional mediation between the human and the divine, none of that would have the cultural dominance it has now if the Gnostic stream had remained inside the institution rather than being expelled from it. When an institution attacks a teaching, not because it's philosophically wrong, but because it's institutionally threatening, you're looking at suppressed truth. That's my read. And I'll tell you why I hold it so firmly. The primary accusation against the Gnostics, across Irenaeus, Tertullian, Epiphanius, and the other heresiologists, those were the self-appointed refuters of what they called heresy, was not that the Gnostics were violent. They weren't. It was not that they were socially dangerous in any criminal sense. The accusation was consistently that they were making the divine too accessible, that they were removing the priest, removing the institution, removing the sacramental mediation, and placing the encounter with the divine entirely inside the individual soul. No priest required, no liturgy required, no doctrinal test required. You either had the gnosis or you didn't, and if you didn't, no amount of church attendance would manufacture it. Can't exactly put a collection plate in front of someone's internal awakening. Just saying. That's the institutional motive, and once you see it, it's very hard to unsee. The burning of texts, and texts were burned, systematically. The Nag Hammadi library survived only because someone, presumably a monk from a nearby community, buried them in a sealed jar in the Egyptian desert sometime around the late 4th century, almost certainly in response to a purge. The burning of texts was not theological housekeeping. It was the elimination of competition. The Gnostic framework, if it had survived intact and in circulation, would have made every bishop, every priest, every institutional intermediary between the human being and the divine structurally redundant. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's a business model under threat. And here's what strikes me most when I read the heresiologists carefully. And I've spent a lot of time with Irenaeus specifically because he's the most thorough and the most revealing in what his objections actually expose. He never argues that gnosis isn't real. He argues that it's being claimed by the wrong people, through the wrong channels, outside the proper institutional framework. Which is a very different objection, If Gnosis were simply false, you'd argue it's false. If Gnosis is real but dangerous because it bypasses your institution, you argue it's dangerous. He argued it was dangerous. And the Nag Hammadi texts survived in spite of that danger, buried in the sand for 16 centuries, until a farmer cracked open a sealed jar in 1945 and history shifted. I rewatched the documentation on that discovery after my deep read of the Matrix video, and by the way, if you haven't watched that one yet, I rewatched the Matrix after reading the Nag Hammadi. I can't unsee it now. The layering there is extraordinary. But what moved me about the discovery itself was the timing. 1,600 years of silence, and then the texts come back into the world in the same century that produced the most sophisticated systems of mass media, mass distraction, and mass identity formation the Archonic framework could ever have dreamed of. That timing feels less like accident and more like necessity. Here's the part that makes some people uncomfortable, and I think it's worth sitting with the discomfort rather than softening it. The Gnostic texts are not universalist documents. They don't operate from the assumption that every human being has equal access to Gnosis or equal capacity to receive it. The Valentinian framework in particular, and this is one of the more controversial dimensions of Gnostic thought, so I want to be precise rather than sensationalist about it, divides humanity into three categories: the Hylics, the Psychics, and the Pneumatics. The Hylics are those whose consciousness is essentially anchored in matter, not through fault, not through failure, but through constitution. The material identification is total. The Archonic seal is, in this framework, functionally complete. The pneumatic light is present, technically, because the Gnostic texts generally hold that some degree of pneumatic seed exists in all human beings, but the conditions for its activation are simply not present in this lifetime. The Psychics are those who have a developed interior life, a genuine ethical orientation, a sincere religious feeling, but who relate to the divine primarily through faith, through doctrine, through external mediation. This, the Valentinians argued, is where most practicing Christians actually were, not condemned, not lost, but operating at a register below the full pneumatic recognition. The Psychic operates from belief. The pneumatic operates from gnosis. Both may point toward the same source. Only one has touched it directly. The pneumatics are those in whom the Sophia-breathed fragment has become sufficiently active, sufficiently recognized by the soul it inhabits, that the path toward liberation is genuinely open. Not guaranteed, open. Now, I want to be honest about why I find this framework uncomfortable in one specific dimension. And it's not the hierarchy itself that gives me pause, because I think the Gnostic texts are describing something real about differential spiritual development rather than making a statement about human worth. What gives me pause is how easily this framework can be co-opted. How quickly I am a pneumatic becomes a spiritual ego, another identity constructed by the very archonic mechanism the pneumatic project is supposed to dissolve. The person most certain they have escaped the trap is often the person most thoroughly caught in its next layer. The genuine pneumatic, as the texts describe it, is not certain of their pneumatic status. They are certain of the recognition itself, which is a different thing. The recognition doesn't inflate the self. It clarifies it. There's a passage in the Gospel of Truth, the Valentinian homily found at Nag Hammadi, probably the most beautiful piece of prose in the entire corpus in my reading, that says the one who receives knowledge knows where he has come from and where he is going. Not who he is in relation to others, where he has come from and where he is going. The orientation is not comparative, it's directional. And that directional orientation is precisely what the tunnel disrupts, because the tunnel offers an arrival, an endpoint, a destination that says, you have reached the place of rest, you can stop navigating. And for a soul that is oriented, that has maintained the thread of pneumatic attention through a lifetime of archonic static, that offer is recognizable as a forgery. Not because the soul is suspicious, because the soul already knows what the genuine destination feels like, and this isn't it. The resolution is too low. The warmth is too manufactured. The piece has the texture of conclusion rather than the texture of source. I think about this sometimes when I try to explain to people who aren't already inside this framework why any of it matters. Why would someone care about Gnostic cosmology? Why spend this much attention on texts that are 2,000 years old, written in Coptic, excavated from a jar in the Egyptian desert? And the answer I keep coming back to is this. Because the question the Gnostic tradition is asking, who are you, really, beneath every layer the world has named you, and the system has shaped you, and the cycle has processed you? That question doesn't age. That question is as current as whatever you woke up thinking about this morning, as current as the anxiety you carry about what happens after death, as current as the sense, which I suspect a significant number of you watching this carry, that something about the story you were handed about what you are and why you're here is missing something crucial. Not wrong, necessarily, missing something. The Gnostic tradition says, what's missing is the interior direction. Not the external story. The external story may be beautiful, may be genuinely meaningful, but the interior direction, the felt recognition of where the pneuma in you came from and what it is oriented toward. Without that, even the most elaborate spiritual framework leaves you at the threshold with no thread to follow. And a soul with no thread to follow will follow the light that's offered. Because light is better than darkness, and something is better than nothing, and the tunnel knows that. The tunnel was built for souls who have no other orientation. The preparation is not about refusing the tunnel. The preparation is about becoming the kind of soul for whom refusal isn't even a dramatic act. It's just a recognition of what is real and what is not. So let me bring this all the way home, because everything we've covered, the Archons, the tunnel, the recycling mechanism, the refusal, the preparation, it all converges on a single point that the Gnostic tradition has been pointing at for 2,000 years, and that most people alive today have never been handed a framework to even consider. The soul that knows itself does not follow the light because it has no need to. That's the whole thing. That's what every text we've looked at, the Apocryphon of John, the Pistis Sophia, the exegesis on the soul, that's what they're all circling. Not as theology, not as mythology, as a map. A map for what happens when the body stops, when the personality dissolves, when the last anchor to the material world is cut and the pneuma, that spark, that genuine divine fragment, is left to navigate without the instrument it has used its entire life. What does a soul do in that moment? If it has spent its life turning outward, toward petitions, toward received doctrine, toward authority structures telling it what is real, it will look outward then too. And what it will find, looking outward in that liminal space, is a light that presents itself as home, warm, familiar, beckoning. And the Gnostic tradition says that is the demiurge's last move. That is the system completing its function. Draw the pneuma back into the cycle, back into matter, back into forgetting. Not through force, through recognition of a false home by a soul that never learned to recognize the real one. But the soul that has spent its life turning inward, not in narcissism, not in spiritual self-obsession, but in the specific, disciplined practice of recognizing the divine spark as its actual nature and orienting toward the pleroma as its actual origin, that soul is not tricked by the light. Not because it's smarter, not because it performed some ritual correctly, but because it knows the difference between a home and a simulation of a home. And you cannot unknow that difference once it has settled in you. I want to be precise here because this is where I think most people either check out or misapply what the tradition is actually teaching. This is not about becoming the kind of person who refuses everything. It's not about cultivating suspicion as a spiritual practice. It's not about arriving at death with your arms crossed and a knowing smirk. The Gnostic texts are not coaching defiance. They are coaching recognition. There's a difference, and the difference is enormous. Defiance is still a reaction. Recognition is not. When you recognize that you are the pneuma, not the body, not the personality, not the accumulated beliefs and fears and identities. When that recognition is not a concept you've read about, but something you have touched in your own interior, something that has rearranged how you understand what you are, the tunnel doesn't require a dramatic refusal. It requires nothing from you except what you already are. A wave does not have to try to be the ocean. It already is. The question is only whether it knows it. And this is what the monad call is oriented toward. This is what the pneumatic discipline is for. This is why the Gnostics were not, at their core, building a new religion. They were dismantling the need for the structures that religions produce, the intermediaries, the rituals, the institutional gatekeepers between the human and the divine. Because the moment you know what you actually are, intermediaries become redundant. The tunnel becomes visible for what it is. The Archon's last mechanism loses its purchase. So here is where I'm leaving you. Not with a 9-step practice, not with a promise that if you believe the right things, you'll escape the cycle. The Gnostic tradition is not a new belief system to swap in for the old one. It is an invitation to do the hardest thing, to turn inward far enough and honestly enough and long enough that you stop needing to be told what is real. Because the deepest truth the Archons do not want you to carry into death is not a secret formula. It's the felt, interior, unmediated recognition of your own origin. You are not from here. You know that. Some part of you has always known that. The tradition didn't invent that knowing. It named it. And the naming matters, because a soul that has a name for what it is can hold on to that name when everything else dissolves. That's the thread. That's the only preparation that matters. If this reached something in you, not just intellectually, but somewhere below that, leave a comment that says, "I know what I am. I want to know who else this landed for." And if you've been following this series, the video on what happens when you practice the monad call every night for a year, what stopped happening, what shifted, what became quiet, that one is waiting for you. It's one of the most important things I've put out. The title is, "I've called the monad every night for a year. Here's what stopped happening." Go there next. This conversation is not finished.